So we will begin. Om Ajnanatimirandasya Jnananjanashalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Guruve Namaha. Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kada Mahyam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yuta Padakamalam Shri Gurum Vaishnavamsha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunatham Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakam Vitamsha Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prishtaya Bhutale Srimate Bhakti Vedanta Swaminiti Namine Namaste Saraswate Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Pashyatya Deshatarine He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Deenabandhu Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namastute तप्त कांचन गौरांगी राधे वृंदावनेश्वरी वृषभानुसुते देवी प्रणमामि हरिप्रिये वाञ्छाकल्पतरुभ्यस्य कृपा सिन्धुभ्य एव च पतितानां पावनेभ्यो वैष्णवेभ्यो नमो नमः जय श्री कृष्ण चैतन्य प्रभु नित्यानंद श्री अद्वैत गदाधर श्रीवासादि गौर भक्त वृंद हरे कृष्ण 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 हरे 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 राम 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 हरे 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 कृष्ण. So welcome back to our Saturday and Sunday series on exploring Raganuga Bhakti. So we have been actually discussing some of the most important aspects of a very elevated stage in our practice of devotional service, which is part of sadhana bhakti, but still it is very elevated and very lofty. In sadhana bhakti, there are these two divisions, Vaidhi sadhana bhakti and Raganuga sadhana bhakti. So let me summarize what we have been discussing till now and continue our discussion forward. So if you remember, it's like we might feel that we have gone, off track, but we have not gone off track. We are on track. The whole discussion of Raganuga Bhakti began with the definition of what is the definition of Raganuga Bhakti. Raganuga Bhakti means those who follow the Ragatmika Bhaktas. And then we went to the definition of who is a Ragatmika Bhakta. The Ragatmika Bhaktas are the Brajbasis, the eternal associates of the Lord. Then we understood these terms, Raga, Anuraga, and Ragatmika. And also we saw the definitions based on Ragvartama Chandrika also. Few verses we saw there. And we discussed that there are these two types of Ragatmika Bhakti, Sambandha Rupa and Kama Rupa. We defined and gave scriptural proofs for these types of bhakti from the 7th canto of the Srimad Bhagavatam. And this was a very elaborate discussion which we had, based on the Narad Muni and Yudhishthira Maharaj conversation. And the scriptural proof was given, and their destinations were mentioned quite elaborately. And their destinations is not the same. The demons who also absorb their mind out of hatred and envy, they attain liberation, where the gopis attain the lotus feet of the Lord. So that's how we have been going on with the discussion directly from Bhakti Rasamrit Sindhu. And in this Ragatmika Bhakti, there are these two divisions, Kama Rupa Ragatmika Bhakti and Sambandha Rupa. And both these definitions we saw, and the scriptural proofs also we had seen. Now, when we came to this subject of qualification or adhikar for Raganuga Bhakti, two verses of the Bhakti Rasamrit Sindhu mentions that it is lubdha, that atra adhikarivan. And lob, because of what? Tat bhavadi madhurya, shute dhira yad apakshate. When he hears these different moods of the eternal associates of Vrindavan who practice devotion to Krishna, and they are not, their intelligence is now not ready to follow the injunctions of the Shastra, na atra shastram na yukti, nor logic, then one has attained lobha. So only two verses we saw from the Bhakti Rasamrit Sindhu, and we went into an elaborate discussion about what is this entire lobe. So why we are taking this caution is to actually understand that the adhikar for practicing Raganuga Bhakti is pure spiritual greed, which happens with the purification of practicing Vaidhi Sadhana Bhakti. So with respect to this greed, we elaborately discussed from Shuddha Bhakti Chintamani by Shivram Swami Maharaj. And we saw various themes, the rare transition of a devotee from Vaidhi to Raganaga. It happens at the stage of Nishtha. And then what are the symptoms of one who has attained this Nishtha stage? Only one who has these symptoms, he is said to be on Nishtha stage, and he is qualified now to make this transition from Vaidhi to Raganuga. And what is the mentality of such a devotee who is fixed in attaining Vraj Bhakti? He doesn't care a damn. He's completely indifferent to anything in this world. And then further, we analyze this greed. So important it is that what is this actual greed? How do we understand this greed? So there are further understanding of this greed for practicing Raganuga Bhakti, and we saw this figurative analysis, how our conditioned state has these 6 anarthas: lust, anger, greed, illusion, pride, and envy. And after Nishtha, when Kama and Krodha are pacified, slowly the spiritual greed awakens and we get awakened to our reality. And what is pride here, which is a sign of envy? Last time I forgot to tell, it is humility, that I am a servant of Krishna. So humility dawns in at the stage of Nishtha also, we discussed that. So we did this figurative analysis, and there are these different types of greeds. One is called as ajata lobha and jata lobha. Ajata means one which is immature greed, another is mature greed. Immature greed is one who is stepping into practice of Raganuga Bhakti. Mature greed is somebody who is at the bhava and prema stage, or who are the eternal associates. And there can be another kind of greed which is not permanent, it is temporary. So Bhaktivinoda Thakur makes that analysis. So we had a very, very in-depth understanding of this greed. And what happens if we don't have adhikar and start trying to imitate in following the footsteps of the Ragatmika Bhaktas of the eternal associates? We saw this Gopi Bhav, club controversy quite in detail. And then we had this further deliberations on the greed. Tatra laulyam eka mulanam. What are the symptoms? We are completely attached to Krishna and there is complete distaste for anything not related to Krishna. So these are the few things also we discussed in the last class. Now today, there is one more small theme which we are going to discuss and end this discussion of Shivram Swami Maharaj about elaboration of what is this greed, adhikar required for practice of Raganuga Bhakti. So after hearing last, I think 3-4 classes on quite exhaustive understanding of this greed, and the effects or the disasters what can happen if one who doesn't have adhikar tries to imitate or follow in the footsteps of other Ragatimika Bhaktas, what kind of attitudes we should have about spontaneous devotion? What is our Acharya's outlook? So we will see the conservative and the liberal attitudes about spontaneous devotion. So spontaneous here means Raganuga Bhakti. Actual spontaneous devotion begins at bhava and prema, and it is permanently there in the Vrajvasis. So let us begin today's discussion now. Again, this is again from Shivram Swami Maharaj book from the Shuddha Bhakti Chintamani. To avoid the abuse of spontaneous devotion, this book regularly cautions its readers on the subject. So that's why did we have such an elaborate discussion? Because there can be abuse of spontaneous devotion. So as I was mentioning, only gold and diamond are imitated. So similarly, this highest bhav, Shuddh Krishna Prem, which is there in the Vrajvasis, there can be imitations done to show that how exalted I am, or without purity of heart I have attained Krishna. So all these kind of things can happen. There can be abuse of spontaneous devotion. So that's why there were a lot of cautions. We saw that. From those warnings, readers may wrongly deduce that spontaneous devotion is something from which to protect practicing devotees. Oh, you should not discuss about Vraj Bhakti or Raga Bhakti. Devotee should be protected from this. Something like this, we might come to such a understanding. They may think, let devotees practice regulative devotional service and find out about spontaneous devotion when they are liberated. So this can be one extreme of our, conservative attitude. This ultra-conservative attitude may appear valid to some devotees, but it is not the attitude of the Vaishnava Acharyas, including Srila Prabhupada. So let us see what Prabhupada has to say about, practice of Raganuga Bhakti, or, following the Raga Marga. True, many people have been led off the path of pure devotion in the name of Raganuga Bhakti. That phenomena should not be ignored or allowed to grow. Yes, many people can go astray if they don't understand the principles properly from the Shastras like Bhakti Rasamrit Sindhu, Upadeshamrit, and especially the Srimad Bhagavatam. If they don't practice their bhakti based on the scriptures, as Rupa Goswami also says, Shruti Smriti Puranadai Pancharatri Vidin Vina Aikantika Harer Bhaktir Utpat Eva Kalpate. Utpat, it creates complete disturbance in the society. But Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur reasons that the fault is not with spontaneous devotion, but with its false teachers. So there are false teachers who propagate that, without practicing Vaidhi Bhakti, we can just directly practice Raganuga Bhakti. Without, having any adhikar, we can just go and practice spontaneous devotion. So it is the false teachers who propagate this. So it's not the fault with spontaneous devotion. Ignoring Raganuga Bhakti, he writes, has not made it unimportant. Indeed, he goes on to say that preventive and discouraging methods do not offer any positive cure for such abuse and have, as a matter of fact, been found to be practically useless. So just preventing and discouraging, doesn't have any cure. You have to give the cure also. We should present the right conception of spontaneous devotion and thus stem the tide of immature practice. So the right understanding of what is Raganuga Bhakti, that is why we saw the definitions of Rupa Goswami in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, and we had elaborate discussion from the Shuddha Bhakti Chintamani. What is the right conception? What is real greed? What is spiritual greed? Whether it is real or is imitation, whether we are in Nishta stage, whether we have the symptoms of Nishta. So all these right conceptions have to be given about Adhikar for practicing Raganuga Bhakti. Srila Prabhupada's Guru Maharaj explains that spontaneous devotion is part and parcel of the soul and cannot be ignored. Instead, it should be understood through the teachings of Rupa Goswami by devotees surrendered to the lotus feet of their spiritual masters. So the real teachings of Raganuga Bhakti should be understood from Srila Rupa Goswami. Rupa Goswami is our Acharya who has, come to propagate this Vraj Bhakti, and through his books, especially Nectar of Devotion and Nectar of Instructions. So these are so important books that Srila Prabhupada made them part of the Bhakti Shastri course. And in fact, part of the Bhakti Shastri course is also Raganuga Bhakti, Bhava Bhakti and Prema Bhakti, the first 19 chapters. It is interesting to note that opinions vary even among Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur's followers about how devotees should hear the topic of Raj Bhakti. So there are different opinions among the followers of Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur. And Shivaram Swami Maharaj is giving some examples. For example, when a senior god brother of Srila Prabhupada learned that in ISKCON, devotees chant Jai Radha Madhav before Bhagavatam class, he thought it too liberal. Now, here I would like to make a point, and this is also in a context with one of the questions somebody had asked during the discussion in the last few classes. I'm going to this picture to explain a very important principle, that when a devotee comes in devotional life, especially in ISKCON, with sadhu sang, attains the shraddha, and with the sadhu sang takes up to the practice of bhakti, sadhana bhakti has these two leaves, as Vishwanath Chakra Thakur mentions in his Madhara Kaudamani, Kleshagni and Shubhada. So sadhana bhakti, with practice of sadhana bhakti, what will happen? Two characteristics manifest, Kleshagni and Shubhada. Kleshagni means all the distress, miseries, different types of miseries are all destroyed by the process of bhakti, and bhakti gives Shubhada. Shubha means auspicious spiritual qualities. So he compares this to a leaf, and the upper portion of the leaf is smooth, and the lower portion of the leaf, here is the lower portion showed, is smooth. Or actually it is in reality sorry, I was wrong about it. The upper portion is smooth and the lower portion is rough. So he compares the upper portion, which is smooth, to be Raga Bhakti, and the lower portion to be Vaidhi Bhakti. Vaidhi Bhakti is following the injunctions of the Shastra, and Raga Bhakti is, impelled by Lobha. So both these leaves spring up. So Vishwanath Chakra Thakur goes on to say, and Srila Prabhupada, how he gave us in ISKCON, that with our initial days in ISKCON, we also have attraction. Srila Prabhupada has, inbuilt rag within Vaidhi. This is my point. He has inbuilt rag. So Jai Radha Madhava is a very confidential bhajan which reveals entire Vrindavan. Srila Prabhupada, once he was giving a lecture on this, bhajan, Jai Radha Madhav, Kunja Bihari. Kunja Bihari means who takes pleasures in performing leelas in the kunjas, in the grooves of Vrindavan. All the pastimes of Krishna are there in this song, Jai Radha Madhava. So just hearing these songs attracts, our attention towards Krishna and Krishna Bhakti. The beautiful deities, especially if you go to any temple, in ISKCON, you can find the deities are very beautifully dressed. So there is attraction to the deities. There is some spontaneous attraction towards the deities. And the Tulsi Arti, Morai Abhilash, Bilas Kunja Diyovas. So what are we paying? So within Vaidi, Rag is included. But we should understand that as long as by practice of Vaidhi Bhakti, the heart is not sufficiently purified, we have not yet attained Nishtha, practice of Ragano Bhakti doesn't start. But within Vaidhi, Rag is included. So that's my point. That is very important, which I wanted to mention with respect to this statement of what Prabhupada is saying. Prabhupada, he gave us, Jai Radha Madhav prayers. This is so wonderful. Immediately it situates us in Vrindavan when we sing these, beginning of the class. He thought it too liberal. He could not, how is it so liberal? Prabhupada was very liberal. Neither did he approve Radha Krishna's swing festival as it is held in every ISKCON temple. So the Julan Yatra, Srila Prabhupada introduced the Julan Yatra, Radha Krishna swinging festival, and we celebrate during this Kartik month. I don't know exactly when it is celebrated, but this Julan Yatra is such a very wonderful way of worshipping Krishna, and our heart is spontaneously attracted to such wonderful festivals. So Srila Prabhupada very expertly, for sadhakas who are practicing Vaidhi sadhana bhakti, gave us also some hint about or some spontaneity within their sadhana bhakti. So when we go to, yatras to the holy places like Vrindavan, Mayapur, and we hear from the pure devotees there, so there is a natural attraction we develop. So this is how Srila Prabhupada had, inbuilt raga, spontaneity within Vaidhi. So this is how Srila Prabhupada did. Another Gaudiya Mutt sannyasi recounts that Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur forbade his disciples to read Ramanand Rai's discussion with Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. This was told directly to the author. So the author is Shivram Swami Maharaj. So he met one Gaudiya Mutt sannyasi, and that sannyasi told that our Guru Maharaj, Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur, he did not allow us to read Rai Ramanand conversation. Now, of course, Srila Prabhupada gave no such instruction, but in fact encouraged devotees to distribute the Chaitanya Charitamrita in public, even the volume containing that discourse. So Srila Prabhupada printed Chaitanya Charitamrita and profusely distributed even in libraries. And many devotees, read Chaitanya Charitamrita and got attracted to Mahaprabhu's movement. So, of course, the lofty discussions which are there in the Rai Ramanand conversation, that is Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's conversation with Rai Ramanand, which happens in Andhra in Kuvur, that is the pinnacle of the entire Gaudiya Vaishnava philosophy. And before that, this is there, I think, in the 8th chapter of Madhya Leela. Before that is also Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya's Liberation, where there is solid, philosophy based on the Upanishads and the Vedanta given. So one also should read the Chaitanya Charitamrita right from the beginning. Chaitanya Charitamrita, the first 14 verses in the first chapter form what is called as the Mangalacharan. And these 14 verses are explained in almost 12 chapters. So there is solid philosophy also given, and slowly with the philosophical understanding, these higher discussions on tattva or rasa, which happens between Ramananda and Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, is there. But of course, we should also take the permission of our spiritual masters to even read these conversations. And before these conversations begin to higher lofty levels, you can see that there is deep Siddhanta discussion happening between Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and Ramanand Rai. We should also try to understand those discussions. So that is how Prabhupada was very liberal in presenting, this philosophy of Raj Bhakti. Thus, in some person's vision, Srila Prabhupada was quite liberal in making known the process of Raganuga Bhakti. Srila Prabhupada was very, very liberal in making known the process of Raganuga Bhakti. So this is about the conservative and the liberal attitude, and how Prabhupada's attitude was towards Raganuga Bhakti. Although we saw the pitfalls of somebody who doesn't have adhikar, who might take up to Raganuga Bhakti, there is chances of deviation. But the way, Prabhupada has given us, he has inbuilt, Raga Bhakti within Vaidi, but we should understand it very systematically from, the scriptures like Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu and Upadeshamrits. So this is an important point. Obviously, whatever others may think, Srila Prabhupada's followers will consider his presentation of Krishna consciousness, including his presentation of spontaneous devotional service, perfectly balanced in every way. So there is a perfect balance Srila Prabhupada has given us. So that is regarding, what Shivaram Swami Maharaj had to say about two verses what we discussed from the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu about Lobh, and elaborately we went last two classes about this greed. Now, do you have any questions up till now what we have discussed? Because I want to start another important theme which we had begun in the last few classes. Any questions regarding till now what we discussed? Okay, then. So let us now explore something more from Ragavartmak Chandrika. As I had mentioned, Ragavartma Chandrika is a book exclusively written by Srila Vishwanath Chakra Thakur on the path of spontaneous devotion. Now, before we go into that, I would like to just go back. When we began the discussion on Raganuga Bhakti, we quoted few verses from the Ragavartma Chandrika. And after that, we then went into Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu again. So I just want to go back to that so that we understand. So first is this Mangala Charan verse. Shri Rupa Vaka Sudaswadi Chakarobhyo Namo Nama Esham Kripala Vakshe Ragavartmani Chandrikam. So he offers his obeisances to Rupa Goswami, and by his mercy, he is writing this Ragavartma Chandrika. And then he has written this Bhakti Rasamrit Sindhu Bindu. It is a summary study of Bhakti Rasamrit Sindhu. But there, Raganuga Bhakti was not given in detail, but now he is explaining in detail in this book, Ragavartma Chandrika. This is what he says in text 2. And text 3, he gives a definition. Devotion impelled by the injunctions of scripture is called Vaidi, and devotion incited by spiritual greed is called Raganuga. And then, to advance in devotional life means to nurture the single-minded desire to engage exclusively in the limbs of bhakti. And this is done by following scriptural injunctions and by intense spiritual greed. And for this, what you need? Adhikar. According to one's qualification, there are these two types of practitioners. So when we get the adhikar to practice Raganuga Bhakti, when spiritual greed awakens. So till here, we had seen 4 verses of Ragamartaka Chandrika. Now let us see the further verses, because we have enough discussion about now greed, and 2 verses of Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu which explain that greed, adhikar. So let us see what Vishwanath Chakra Thakur has to say in his Ragavartma Chandrika about this adhikar of Lobh. So let us go into that. Now, his is a Sanskrit prose. I have just mentioned the Sanskrit. I don't know much Sanskrit, but the English translation is there. Tatra Lobha Lakshita Swayam Shri Rupa Goswami Charanera Eva. In Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, Shri Rupa Goswami has described the symptoms of pure greed as follows. So the adhikar he had mentioned in the 4th verse, as you need adhikar to practice Raganuga Bhakti. So where is this adhikar mentioned? In Rupa Goswami's Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. And this greed here is called as pure greed. It is not material greed, it is spiritual greed. So let us see that verse. तत्तद्भावादि माधुर्य श्रुते धीर्यदपेक्षते नात्रं शास्त्रं न युक्तिं च तल्लोभपत्य लक्षणम. So this is the same verse he is quoting, and these two verses we have already discussed with respect to greed. So this is the same verse he quotes. Now, व्रजलीला परिकरस्त शृंगारादि भाव माधुरे श्रुते धीरिदं मम भूयात् इति लोभपत्य काल शास्त्र युक्तपेक्षया न स्वात् सत्यं च तस्यां लोभतस्यैव सिद्धिः. Upon hearing about the sweetness of the sentiment of the amorous love, Vrajlila Parikarasta Shringaradi Bhav and other moods. Shringar Adi means, there is Madhurya Ras, Sakya Ras, Vatsalya and Dasya Ras. Madhurya Shute. Madhurya means the sweetness of the sentiments, of the moods, how these Vrajvasis practice, that exist in the associates of Krishna's Vraj pastimes. Vraj Lila Parikar. These are the eternal associates. One may yearn. May such a mood arise in my heart. Shute, by hearing, Dhir, idam mama bhuyat iti lobapatti. Let also me develop this mood to practice, Vraj Bhakti, following in their footsteps. So this kind of a yearning might come in our heart. Now, this yearning might come just by hearing some sannyasi lectures on Vraj Bhakti, Krishna Leela. We hear it, but as I explained, this yearning, whether it is, temporary or is it permanent? Is it really a greed or it is just temporary greed? At that time, he need not he need no longer rely on logic and scriptural arguments. Shastra yukti apeksha na swat. Satyam cha tasya lobat tasyeva siddhi. So, if that greed is really a permanent greed, then his heart does not rely on logic or scriptural, arguments. So that was the most important point also here. Na attar shastram na yuktim cha. So this is what exactly he is explaining in the Sanskrit, prose. Now he gives further details. Na hi kenachit shastra drishtya लोभ क्रियते नापलोभनीय वस्तु प्राप्तो स्वस्य योग्यायोग्यत्व विचारकोपि उद्भवति. If such scriptural impetus persists, now we hear about Krishna Leela, after some time, still what happens? We want to, still follow the injunctions of the scriptures, we are still not attracted to the Vrajvasis. So if the scriptural impetus persists, then one's sentiments cannot be identified as greed. Na hi kenachit shastra drishti lobha kriyate napi lobhaniya vastu. No one ever develops greed on the basis of scriptural injunctions, nor is there any consideration of spiritual qualification or lack thereof for obtaining it. So greed just cannot be acquired by, just, studying about Vraj Bhakti or doing a lot of tapasya. It is actually bestowed by Krishna himself when one, comes to the stage of Nishtha. So, yogya, ayogya, vichara, kopi, udbhavati. So there is no consideration, nor there is any consideration of spiritual qualification. No one ever develops greed on the basis of scriptural injunctions. So by following the scriptural injunctions, you cannot develop greed. This is the point he makes. Kintu lobhniya vastuni shrute drishte va swata eva lobha utpadate. So then how does lobh come? Rather, greed arises spontaneously. simply upon hearing about or seeing the object of one's longing. Spontaneously, greed arises from hearing. Now, this spontaneity, when it comes, we discussed quite elaborately when the heart is sufficiently purified, and once one who is on the stage of Nishtha, hearing, practicing Vaidhi Bhakti over a period of time, over a period of years, suddenly this spontaneity arrives. So this is a very important point Vishwanath Chakra Thakur is mentioning. So I would like to make this analysis here. There is one question, but I'll take it up. Right now, we are in a stage of spontaneous sense gratification. We see some object which we have attraction to, hot samosas being fried, and spontaneous, there is attraction to sense gratification. So from spontaneous sense gratification, we have to go to what? Regulated devotional service. That is Vaidhi Bhakti. So we have to go to this next step of what? Regulated devotional service. And with the practice of regulated devotional service, there is what happens when the heart is purified. There is spontaneous devotional service, or what is called as Raganuga Bhakti. So this is the point here. We should understand how this greed arises spontaneously. It happens with the intense practice of Vaidhi Sadhana Bhakti. So there is one question. So let me take it up. Yes, Prem Prabhuji. What's the question?
Hare Krishna, Prabhu. Dandavat Pranam. So, Prabhu, I wanted to just ask in terms of this spontaneity itself, right? I mean, how, and I think you already answered in terms of how we kind of spontaneously feel, this greed for material things, and specifically even children, right? For the matter, the moment they hear about their toys or any particular thing, how they are, we are currently, conditioned or developed. But I think you already answered that, Prabhu, that, we move from, uh, you know, sense gratification to, you know, having the standard practice of doing bhakti, and then our heart is fully conditioned to be in a more of the spiritual greed.
Oh, it's clear, no? Fine.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
But yeah, so, okay. So with the practice of Vaidhi Sadhana Bhakti, slowly the heart purification happens and this greed arises spontaneously. So the key is the more we practice the Vaidhi Sadhana Bhakti, given by Rupa Goswami in Bhakti Rasamrit Sindhu, the angas of Vaidhi Sadhana Bhakti, and the purification will happen, and that figurative analysis, if you remember. So that is how we should understand. Further, now with respect to this text 5, there are some comments. In Jaiva Dharma is a book written by, a novel in fact written by Bhaktivinoda Thakur, where he has systematically taken the subject matter of the jiva in the material world who's conditioned, how he should understand these important tattvas. Who am I? Who is God? What is this material world? Jiva, Jagat and Prakriti, and Jagadishwar. From there he begins his discussion, and then enters into Bhakti Rasamrit Sindhu, Vaidhi Sadhana Bhakti, Raganuga Sadhana Bhakti, and then Madhurya. Like that, he systematically goes in the form of conversation. Thakur confirms that after one has heard about the supremely sweet moods of the Vrajvasis, the consequent disposition of hankering to attain those moods signifies that spiritual greed has appeared. So there should be, one should attain that mood, and it signifies that there is spiritual greed. Upon hearing narrations about Krishna, a person with a propensity for regulative devotional will scrutinize what he has heard with his intelligence, with what is said in the scriptures, and with reasoning. So, one who is practicing Vaidhi Bhakti, he will use his intelligence based on Shastra and his reasoning capacity. Only when these three are consistent with what he has heard does he go forward. So until then he cannot go forward in his hearing. That's why you see, when we hear the lectures, we have questions, and Vraj Bhakti or Vraj what Krishna performs, which are under the Yoga Maya, may Ananya Vishaya Rati Madhupate Sakrit, as Kunti Maharani says. It's just flow of nectar. So there is no use of intelligence required because it is just nectarian katha which is nourishing the soul. But those who are practicing Vaidhi Sadhana Bhakti, when they hear, although they are hearing this pure Krishna Leela, they are using their intelligence in trying to understand this Krishna Leela, and that's why there is so many questions. So these things are happening. They scrutinize what is heard with intelligence, with what is said in the scriptures, and with reasoning. But Rag Marg does not work like this. On this path, there is no place for intelligence, scripture, or reasoning. The only consideration is greed for the devotional moods of the Vrajvasis. So this is, how a Raga Bhakta works. What sweet feelings do the Vrajvasis have for Krishna? Can I ever have such sentiments? If so, how they can be attained? So he is maddened now. He's spiritually a mad person now. How to attain that mood? And if you try to, instruct him about tattva, although there is, understanding is there, but he is more attracted to develop that mood. So this is how Rag Marg works. Floundering in a state of intense agitation, one becomes desperate for these moods. Such anxiety and intense covetousness are the prime symptoms of this greed. In the absence of these symptoms, one should understand that zeal for Raganubhakti has not yet arisen. So just to give a material example, when we become intensely greedy to attain something in this world, we are driven by it, and we take so much anxiety and so much trouble just to get that object, and that time intelligence doesn't function. If you see, dhyayato vishayan pumsan sangashteshu krodh abhijayate krodhat bhavati sammoha. So much is the moha, lobha pahata chetasa, as I was also speaking the Bhagavad Gita verse. And we just go ahead, towards material sense objects. But for Krishna, who is the real spiritual sense object, when this spiritual greed awakens, there is no use of intelligence. Just like, when material greed awakens, intelligence doesn't function and we just go for it. So similarly is the, mood in one spontaneity or greed has awakened. So this is an important comment which was there. Now, Vishwanath Chakra Thakur explains the two sources of such greed. What are the sources of such greed? Let us see. Sacha Bhagavat Kripa Hetuko Anuragi Bhakta Kripa Hetukascheti Dvivida. There are two sources of such greed. Cheti Dvivida. There are two sources. The mercy of Bhagwan and the mercy bestowed by devotees who have spontaneous loving devotion. Bhagavat Kripa Hetu and Anuragi Bhakta Kripa. Anuragi means one who is already a pure devotee, Uttam Adhikari at the Bhava or Prema stage. So these are the two sources of this greed. Tatra Bhakta Kripa Hetukas Dvivida Prakriten Adunekescha. There are again two types of greed arising from the mercy of devotee. From the Bhakta Kripa, Bhagavad Kripa he has not discussed because rarely directly Bhagwan, gives Bhava Bhakti directly to a devotee. There are rare examples like that. In the Bhakti Rasamrit Sindhu, it is there that one young girl, she whole night danced in the Jagannath temple for the pleasure of Lord Jagannath. Jagannath was very pleased and immediately bestowed what to speak Raganuga Bhakti, Bhava Bhakti to her. So that is Bhagavad Kripa. But the Anuragi Bhakta Kripa has two types. These greed arises by the mercy of the devotee. There are two types. Prakritena and Adunekena. Prakrita means, Prachin. And Adhuna means present. So this greed by the mercy of the pure devotees, Anuragi Bhaktas can be ancient or present. Now let us see what he says about ancient. Prakritana Paurva Bhavika Tadrisha Bhakta Kripottah Aduneka Etaj Janmadavadi Tadrisha Bhakta Kripottah. The greed arising from mercy received in previous lives from Krishna's devotees who are endowed with the sweet sentiments of Sri Shamsundar's eternal associates in Vraja is called Prakrita. Prakrita Paurva Bhavika Tadrisha Bhakta Kripa means in the previous life, somebody has associated with a very great saint who was an Anuragi Bhakt. And by his mercy, you have attained that greed in the previous life. Now we will explain this further when we take some of the few verses coming in text 6 only. Now let us see, this is Prakrita or ancient. Let us see. Adunika eta janmavadi tadrisha bhakta kripa. And the greed arising from the mercy of such elevated devotees in the present life only is called Adunika. So in this life, you met a pure Premi Bhakta, and by his mercy, you obtained that greed. That greed has arisen by the mercy of that, pure devotee. So there are these two things, Prakrita and Adunika, ancient and present. So let us go more detail what he says about it. Now it is very important here, and even just a minute, the internet connection is unstable. So let me on the another connection. Hopefully there is no disturbance. Let us see. Okay. Yeah. Those whose spiritual hunger, Adya Sati, has already been awakened in the previous life, will immediately take shelter at the lotus feet of a Raganuga Rasika Guru, Tadrisha Guru Charanashayam, when such greed manifests in this life. So this example, the classic Mangal Thakur in his previous life was a sannyasi, and he had practiced and attained almost the stage of Bhava Bhakti. And because of some aparadh he had committed in the next life, he was born in a Brahmana family because he had practiced spiritual life, but somehow he was attracted to Chintamani, a prostitute. We all know that story. So he, in his previous life, by the mercy, and in this life as a Brahmana, Bilomangal Thakur, by hearing the words of Chintamani, that greed awakened in him to attain Krishna. And immediately he set out to Vrindavan, in fact, in search of spiritual life. And first thing what he did is he took shelter of Guru. He took shelter of Somagiri. Somagiri was a spiritual master. And very quickly, that bhava which was there in the previous life, quickly by his sadhana, immediately manifest. And immediately he went to Vraj. And in Vraj, he was absorbed in Krishna bhajan. So first thing is that, Raganuga Bhakti doesn't mean that, you don't have a guru to practice. Actually, as one enters into these higher realms of devotion, especially Raganuga Sadhana Bhakti, it has to be meticulously practiced under the guidance of a spiritual master regularly. The more one advances, the more he has to take guidance on practice of Raganuga Bhakti. As in Vaidhi Bhakti, the first anga of Vaidhi Bhakti is Ado Guru Padashraya. First is one should take shelter of a spiritual master. Similarly, here Vishwanath Chakra Thakur is saying first we should take a shelter of a Raganuga Rasika Guru. Now, in ISKCON, although we have taken or we might take initiation from a Diksha Guru, there are also Siksha Gurus also in ISKCON who are very elevated. And we might in our Shiksha Gurus also find that somebody is mood matches my mood of practice of the bhakti in the line, that we are like-minded devotees in such. So these Shiksha Gurus also can Dvitiya Guru Charana Ashrayantaram Lobha Pravritar Bhavati. Sadhakas whose greed is recent, however, develop that intense thirst only after taking shelter of the lotus feet of a spiritual master. So in this life also, the greed, when it is recent, they develop that intense thirst only after. Sir, the voice is breaking, so maybe let me change the internet connection. Just switch on to a different connection, I think, because I hope it is clear now. Yeah. Yeah. So those who have developed this greed recent, then they take shelter of the lotus feet of the spiritual master. Slowly, slowly, they start practicing their bhakti. Whereas previously, those who have already awakened rag, they immediately take a shelter of a rasika guru, raganuga rasik guru, you know. But whereas others who have recently developed, they have to systematically go step by step from Vaidhi sadhana bhakti to raganuga sadhana bhakti. And although their movement might be very fast, their progress might be very fast, but this is what Vishwanath Chakra Thakur says. Now he says, Yad Uktam, means it is said, Krishna Tad Bhakta Karunya Matra Lobe Kahetuka Pushti Margataya Kaschid Iyam Raganugochate. In fact, this Loba, which is attained by the mercy of the Bhagavad Bhakta, it is only possible by meeting, uh, by getting the mercy of a pure devotee. So for this, he is quoting Bhakti Rasamrit Sindhu verse. And for your kind information, this is the last verse in Raganuga Bhakti. 1, 2, 3, 9 is the last verse, and he's quoting that. Bhakti Rasamrit Sindhu confirms that engagement in bhakti due to greed, that is lobha, that is the qualification for Raganuga Bhakti, which arises only by the mercy of Sri Krishna and devotees, his devotees, is known as Raga Nuga Bhakti. Some call it the Pushti Marg. So the Vaidhi Marg is called as Maryada Marg, and the Rag Marg is called as Pushti Marg. And this greed awakens by mercy of Krishna Tad Bhakta, or they are pure devotees, Karunaya. Karunaya means by their mercy. So this greed is awakened by, the Lord or pure devotees. It can be ancient or recent, but he's giving reference that, this is the only way, greed can arise by the mercy of the Lord and his devotees. Raganuga Bhakti can be, adhikari we can get and we can practice. So there is one sampradaya called as the Pushti Marg, Vallabhacharya, and Chaitanya Mahaprabhu picked up that principle of Raga Bhakti from there. So this is what he says in text 6, text 7. After this greed has awakened, Tatascha tadrisha lobhato bhaktasya lobani tadbhava praptyupaya jigyasayam satam shastra yukta peksha swat. When both the previously mentioned types of devotees, recent and ancient and recent, those who have either previously acquired or recently acquired greed, tatascha tadrisha lobhato bhaktasya lobaniya, become fervently curious about the means of achieving the ecstatic sentiments of Krishna's eternal associates. Lobaniya, they become extremely curious Tad bhava praptupaya. Praptupaya means what is the upaya to get that? I also want to develop that mood. What the Vrajvasis have. I want to follow in their footsteps. Jigyasayam. Jigyasa means what? You know, he he's trying to understand the means. So here there is very important thing to be understood, that even to practice Raganuga Bhakti, we have to refer the scriptures. Then they depend on the direction of the scriptures and the conducive systems prescribed therein. Satyam Shastram Yukti Apeksha Swat. So Raganuga Bhakti is not something which is sentimental, or it is something which doesn't have any foundation. To practice Raganuga Bhakti also, you will have to study the Shastras which deal with Raganuga Bhakti. And Raganuga Bhakti, now we are just, in the last few classes, 3 to 4 classes, we saw that Adhikar is greed. But how to practice Raganuga Bhakti is also given by Rupa Goswami in 3 verses. And we will be studying these 3 verses quite in detail in the coming classes. So the directions of the scriptures, which are there. Now, this is one scripture we are reading, Raga Vartma Chandrika. There is the Bhakti Rasamrit Sindhu, and there are other scriptures, but these are the most important scriptures. Actually, for us, it is most important that we hear Bhakti Rasamrit Sindhu, Upadeshamrit. We hear the sannyasis speak on the Srimad Bhagavatam slowly, so that we can also develop that kind of greed. But specifically, those who have developed this greed, they will, be specific in their readings about, their mood. They will be specific. In the 10th canto, they will hear Krishna's pastimes with the Gopas. If they have a, mood of a Sakya, ras. So there are directions of the scriptures and there are conducive systems. That's my point here. Shastra vidinaiva Shastra Pratipadita Yuktaiva cha tat pradarsanat nanyata. It is only through the assertion of the scriptures, Shastra Pratipadita Yuktaiva, that such sentiments can be achieved. There is no other way, na anyata. For example, how can a person hankering to drink milk, okay, that is come in the next line, yatha dugdadishu. Oh, it is here, sorry, I have by mistake put this, for example, here, I'll delete it. Now you have to refer the scriptures. That's what Vishwanath Chakra Thakur is saying. But what is he saying? Yatha dugdas, yatha dugdadishu lobe sati katam me dukta adhikam bhavet iti tad upaya jigyasayam tad abhigyapta jana kritopdesha vakya apeksha swat. For example, yatha, how can a person hankering to drink milk acquire it? Dugdadishu loba, I have a hankering to drink milk. At that point, he needs the guidance of a knowledgeable person to learn how and where he can easily obtain milk. Katam me dugdadikam bhavet iti tad upaya. He'll jigyasa. From whom? Abhi gyapta, one who has knowledge. A knowledgeable person he will go. Jana, such person he'll go. Kritopdesha vyakapeksha swat. He will accept Krita Upadesha, instructions on how to purchase a cow and maintain it. So he will go to an experienced person who has knowledge about cows and he knows where to purchase cows. This is the ordinary, science for any subject, you know that. So Vishwanath Chakra Thakur is also giving that same example, that even for Raganuga Bhakti, when Lobha has arisen, how to obtain it, he has to refer to scriptures and go to a knowledgeable person who knows about that science of Raganuga Bhakti. Tataschaga krinato bhavan iti adi tad upadesha vakyad eva gavyam ayan tad ghas pradan tad dohana प्राधिकारिकम tata eva shikshan na tu swata. Only after the cow has given birth to a calf will he able to milk the cow and drink the milk. Tatascha ga krinito means the cow has to give birth to a calf. Till then, milk will not come. In this way, the person thirsty for milk has to accept different directives from a trusted source on buying a cow, milking and feeding her, and so on. Iti adi tad upadesha vakyat eva gaivan ayan tad gas pradhan. In the same manner, a sadhaka filled with greed, tata eva shikshan na tu swata, filled with greed must also profit from relevant instructions. One cannot gain knowledge on his own, na tu swata, he must accept proper direction. So for a mundane thing like, having milk, we need knowledge to have a cow, which kind of cow, how the milk comes, we have to feed grass, it has to give birth. So all these instructions are required. Similarly, when Lobha comes, we need to take instructions from a, Rasika Anuragi Bhakta, a devotee who is expert in Raganuga Bhakti, who can guide. So that is the point Vishwanath Chakra Thakur is mentioning. And then he's giving a reference for this, what he has mentioned of the milk example. Yad Uktam Ashtamai Skande. Yatagnim Idamsi Amrita Chagoshu Bhuvi Annam Ambu Yadyamane Chavrittim Yoger Manushya Adiyante Hitvam Guneshu Buddhya Kavayo Vadanti. So Yada Uktam Ashtamaskande, in the Srimad Bhagavatam, Lord Brahma explains, just as a human being traditionally derives fire from wood, Yatha Agnim Edhamsi. Edhamsi means wood. And from wood you get Agni. Milk from a cow. Amrita cha goshu. Go means cow and milk is called as Amrit. It is nectar. Water from the earth. Bhuvi annam. Annam means to, grains. Grains you can attain from earth. Money from a enterprise, vrittim, and thereby maintains his life. In the same way, O Vishnu, those expert in bhakti, yoger manusha adiyante hitvam, say that we can attain you by utilizing our intelligence to take proper association. By this, we will overcome the three modes, guneshu, buddhya, kavayo, vadanti, three modes of nature, and thus progress gradually in bhakti. So three examples he has given from nature: fire from wood, milk from cow, and grains and water from the earth, and money from enterprise. Similarly, those who are expert in bhakti, by associating with them, proper association, we can ultimately progress in bhakti. So similarly in Raganuga Bhakti, we have to associate with, experts, Rasika gurus who know how to, guide when a person has developed this kind of a greed. So that is the point, and he's giving very wonderful Shastric reference here for this. Further, text 8. Sachalo Baragavartma Vartinam Bhaktanam. Upon the rise of pure greed, the sadhaka following Raga Marg, Raga Varta Vartinam, must engage in hearing and chanting of the transcendental topics from the initial stage of his sadhana. Guru Pad Ashraya Lakshanam Arabhya Swabhishta Vastu Sakshat Praptya Samayam Abhivapya. That is, taking shelter of the lotus feet of the bona fide spiritual master until he achieves his cherished desire of direct darshan of his worshipable deity. Swabhishta, Abhishta Ishta means the Ishtadev, Vastu Sakshat Prapti. Till he gets direct darshan, he has to take shelter of a Guru Pad Ashraya. Arabhya, from the beginning he has to take. So this is so important that, that Raganuga Bhakti is not whimsically practiced, in seclusion in some holy place, especially in Vrindavan. You will find many, so-called advanced devotees who, practice their bhajan sitting in some of the places in Radhakund, Shamkund, or in Govardhan. And you might think they might be practicing Raganavati, but there is a lot of guidance given of the spiritual master is required to practice that sadhana. And that sadhana is called as Raganuga sadhana. And now he is giving again a reference for this. Yatha yatatma paribranjito aso mat punya kata shravanadibine tata tata pashyanti vastu sukshmam chakshur yata avigya chakshur yata iva anjana samprayuktam. When a medicinal ointment is applied to a diseased eye, yata yata atma pari brahmjite aso. The eye's weakness is overcome by its power to discern very subtle objects is restored. In the same way, to the extent that one's heart is purified by repeatedly hearing about and glorifying my supremely sacred pastimes, mat punya gata shravan adi binay, one can receive a glimpse of my form. Tata tata pashyanti vasvu sukshmam, which is beyond the scope of matter. So at the stage one develops this greed, his heart is sufficiently purified. Now, as he starts practicing Raganuga Sadhana Bhakti, his heart gets further purified, and he can subtly perceive the spiritual presence of the Lord in the heart, or direct vision can also happen. But that is at lofty stages. From Raganuga Bhakti, the next stage is Bhava Bhakti. So at Bhava Bhakti, he becomes qualified to actually have darshan of the Lord. So that's why here Lord Krishna, this is mentioned in the Uddhav Gita, this verse, one can receive a glimpse of my form. And this form of Lord Krishna is beyond matter. That is also to be understood, So the heart, with the practice of Raganuga Bhakti, with hearing and chanting of Krishna's pastimes, and with the internal practice of bhajan, what happens? The heart gets more and more purified, and one can perceive the Lord in the heart or perceive him directly. Of course, it is at higher stages at Bhava and Prema. So that is what Vishwanath Chakra Thakur is saying. Iti Bhagavat Ukter Bhakti Hetukanta Hetu Anta Karna Shuddhi Taryatamyat Prati Dinam Adika Adiko Bhavati. The Lord said to Sri Uddhav, Srimad Bhagavatam, as I told you, that verses from the Srimad Bhagavatam, by following this process, the innermost recesses of his heart gradually becomes purified, and he achieves the desired goal according to the degree of purification. Antakarana Shuddhi, Antakaran, our chitta is contaminated now. So the entire subtle body, the mind, intelligence, false ego, and the ahankar all together form the Antakaran. Taratamyat pratidinam adhiko adhiko bhavati. As the Antakaran becomes more and more purified, he can perceive now in that purified state the Lord's presence in the heart. In the heart significantly purified by bhakti, the Lord's divine form manifests of its own accord. For example, Sri Narad. So Sri Narad in his previous life practiced, what he had heard from the Bhakti Vedantas. 4 months he had served the Bhakti Vedantas, and they were constantly chanting the Lord's glories. So that 4 months of association, Narad Muni in his previous life as a son of a Shudra maidservant was highly elevated by the mercy of the Bhakti Vedantas. And when his mother died, he left thinking that this is Lord mercy and started wandering. And when he was exhausted, he sat and started just meditating on the Lord. in the heart, the Lord manifested to Narad Muni in his previous life, I'm speaking. And what happened? Immediately he experienced the Ashta Sattvic Vikars, which happen actually at the stage of Bhava Bhakti. So Narad Muni in his heart was able to perceive the Lord. But the Lord immediately, did not give any more darshan. And Narad Muni was perturbed and very disturbed. Then the Lord spoke in order to give assurance. And he told, "Oh Narad, those whose hearts are not fully still purified, I am not easy to obtain." So Narad Muni had a slight contamination, that he is somehow attached more to the mode of goodness. That's what Jiva Goswami and Vishwanath Chakrathakura explain. So that contamination was there, and Narad Muni in that life just went on passing his life chanting the glories of the Lord, and further got purified and gave up his material body made of filaments, and in the next life he attained a spiritual body as Narad Muni. And as Narad Muni is a spiritual body, he is always able to see the Lord in the heart. Not only in the heart, he can directly go to the Vaikuntha planets and have darshan of Narayan. So, with the degree of purification, the Lord gradually appears in the heart. And this happens at the stage, especially at the stage of Bhava Bhakti, at the end of Raganuga Sadhana. Raganuga Sadhana begins with Nishtha, and with Ruchi, the heart gets more purified. With Asakti for the Lord, it gets still more purified. At Bhava, almost the heart is purified, 95% or 99%, you can say. Some devotees say 99%, it's purified. At that time, we can perceive the presence of the Lord in the heart, and the Lord might give darshan in the heart also to such a very elevated soul who is on Bhava Bhakti. So the example here is of Narada Muni. Text 9. Any questions you have, you can always raise your hands. उद्भूते तादृशे लोभे शास्त्र दर्शितो तद भाव प्राप्त्य उपायेषु आचार्य चैत वपुसा स्वगतिम व्यनंति iti uddhavokta. When the sadhaka attains greed, udbhute tadrisha lobe, the Supreme Lord inspires him by manifesting himself in two forms. Externally, in the form of spiritual master, he gives instructions, and internally, as the super soul, he inspires a person from within the heart about the means to achieve the desired goal. According to the statement made by Sri Uddhav in Srimad Bhagavatam 11:29-6, iti Uddhavokta. So, Vishwanath Chakrathakura has mentioned just Uddhavokta, but this is the verse. So, the Lord can guide from within directly also sometimes. It doesn't mean that, the spiritual master's guidance is required. It is also required. But within also that inspiration can come. Like Bilva Mangal Thakur, although he was with his spiritual master Somgiri practicing, but when that intense greed became so much that he wanted to go to Vrindavan, this intense greed was so intense, his spiritual master forbade him not to go to Vrindavan, be under the association of devotees, which will act as a fence against Maya. But his greed was so intense that it, pushed him to move towards Vrindavan. So sometimes the Lord from within can push us as a super soul. The super soul can inspire us. And Krishna speaks about this in the Bhagavad Gita. Tesham eva anukam partam aham agyanajam tama nashayami atma bhavasto jnana deepena bhasvata. Tesham eva anukampartam, 10.11 in the Bhagavad Gita. Because of my mercy, Tesham eva anukampartam aham agyan ajam tama. The ignorance which is there in the heart, this is, very much almost destroyed, but slight ignorance, whatever is there. Nashayami atma bhavasto jnana deepena bhasvata. I illuminate their hearts with transcendental knowledge. So the inspiration can come from within. That was the point. In order to follow the method illuminated in the scriptures for obtaining one's cherished devotional mood, bhav, some sadhakas with inborn greed gain complete knowledge by hearing instructions directly from the spiritual master. So greed, which has been awakened, you know, the Supreme Lord himself only manifests as spiritual master, and as a Chaitya Guru, he can also guide. So when this greed comes, you know, the scriptures are there, which give instructions on this. Keshuchit Guru Mukhat Keshuchit Abhigya Maha Odaya Anuragi Bhakta Mukhat Abhi Jatushu. Others acquire this knowledge by hearing from the lotus mouth of elevated devotees who are well learned in the deep moods of Raganuga Bhakti. Keshuchit means some others. Guru Mukhat, hearing from the lotus mouth of elevated devotees. Abhigya Maha Daya Anuragi Bhakta. They are very, very well learned, and they are Anuragi Bhaktas, who are highly enlightened in such bhavas. From such mouths we can hear Bhakta Mukat Abhi Jatushu. They hear from them, and that greed develops. Keshuchit Bhakti Mrishta Chitta Vrittishu Swata Eva Spuritashu Solasam Eva Atishayana Pravritti Swat. For few others, this knowledge. Now, what is Vishwanath Chakra Thakur speaking? Please try to understand. He is speaking, previously he spoke about greed, and this greed is, mercy obtained by the Lord or his pure devotees. And this mercy can be ancient or recent. But now he is speaking about practice of Raganuga Bhakti following the scriptures. Now, where is that Shastra? That Shastra he might hear from the Guru. And the Guru can be the spiritual master, or the Guru can be the Chaitya Guru. And sometimes we might hear from some spiritual masters who speak about this subject. So they can acquire the knowledge. Greed is now there, but now you need the knowledge. Just like you want milk, but you need the knowledge how to have a cow. So where is that knowledge coming from? These great Anuragi Bhaktas. Or for few others, this knowledge self-manifests in their immaculate hearts through the nectar of bhakti. Profuse, ecstatic endeavors to attain those moods are witnessed in all these sadhakas. So it can directly manifest in their heart, that anurag, that intense, knowledge. As 10.11 I mentioned, this knowledge can self-manifest in their hearts because of profuse practice of bhakti, and they are internally inspired from within. So this also can happen. Bilva Mangal Thakur again is an example. From within he was inspired. Narad Muni, directly the Lord spoke and inspired him in his previous life. So this is how it can happen. And Vishwanath Chakra Thakur gives a very mundane example. Yata kamartinam kamopyayeshu. Just as a person who desires material happiness strives with great intensity for his own sense enjoyment. One who is a kami, he, to attain the artha, the object, he intensely strives for it. Similarly, one who has developed lobh, spiritual greed, intensely strives for it. And even a kami has to have knowledge how to get that object. So similarly, a person who has developed lobh has to have that knowledge. In the Guru Vandana, we have this famous prayer of Narottam Das Thakur we every day morning sing. Divya Jnana Hriday Prakashito. The Lord can manifest Divya Jnana, transcendental knowledge, Hriday Prakashito. In the heart he can manifest. So that is the point here. Now, text 10. Shastram Sarva Upanishad Sarabhutamesham in Srimad Bhagavatam, which is the essence of all Shastras and Upanishads. Tacha Shastram. Here, Shastram refers to Srimad Bhagavatam. It is what? Sarva Upanishad. It is the essence of all the Upanishads. And Sarabhutam Esham. So it is mentioned. What it is mentioned? Aham Priyatma Sutascha Sakha Guru Suridaivam Ishtam. What it is mentioned? This is in the Kapil Muni's teachings. For my devotees, I am their beloved, their very soul, their friend, their son, their divine master, well-wisher, benefactor, and worshipable Lord. Iti Adi Vakya Nichaya Karshi Bhagavata Mahapurana Eva. So in the Bhagavad Mahapurana it is mentioned. So here this verse which is being quoted by Vishwanath Chakra Thakur, this is referring to somebody who is elevated in very high level of devotional service. He considers, the Lord as my lover, the Lord as my friend, the Lord as my well-wisher. So this is a very intimately, he is, addressing the Lord here. So this can happen only for those who are especially very elevated in spiritual lives. So in the Srimad Bhagavatam, it is speaking about somebody who is at the spontaneous level of devotion, how he sees the Lord. The Lord is my lover, beloved. This kind of a mood. So this is a mood of a Bhava Bhakta or a Premi Bhakta also, Atha tad prati padita bhakti vivarna cham chu Shri Bhakti Rasamrita Arna Vadikam api. So regarding this, scriptures, knowledge, it was mentioned in the previous verse, the knowledge has to be there. So where is this knowledge? This knowledge is there in the Srimad Bhagavatam, first reference he gave, of, spontaneous practice of devotional service, where one considers the Lord as my friend, my master, my son, my lover. Where is the other scripture? In addition, the words Shastra should be accepted for literature such as Bhakti Rasamrit Sindhu, which explain in detail the same bhakti propounded in Srimad Bhagavatam. So how much important is Bhakti Rasamrit Sindhu for us? In fact, we should study Srimad Bhagavatam from the lens of Bhakti Rasamrit Sindhu. When we study Srimad Bhagavatam from the lens of Bhakti Rasamrit Sindhu, then the whole science of bhakti we can understand very nicely. Now, I finished this discussion from Ragvartma Chandrika up till now. I know, of course, this was a little bit Sanskrit and the translation. So whatever best I could do, I have done. So I hope devotees were able to relate. So there is one last topic, which is, again coming back to Bhakti Rasamrit Sindhu, qualification for practicing Raganuga Bhakti. Here, Rup Goswami, composes his own verse and he says, is Vaidhi Sadhaka dependent on Shastras till he reaches Bhava? Is he dependent on Shastras? This is a question he puts. So we know that there are three stages. There is the Uttama Bhakti, Bhakti Rasamrit Sindhu definition, and there are these two types, Sadhana and Sadhya. Within Sadhana is Vaidhi and Raganuga. By practice of Raganuga Bhakti, we attain Bhava Bhakti. So the question here is what? Is a Vaidhi Sadhaka dependent on the Shastras till he reaches Bhava? Whether he'll refer to Shastras until he reaches Bhava. This is the he composes. Vaidhi Bhakti Adhikari tu Bhavavir Bhavavadi Atra Shastram Tata Tarkam Anukulam Apekshata. Those qualified for Vaidhi Bhakti Adhikari tu, are dependent on the rules of scripture and the favorable use of logic. This we know. Atra Shastram Tata Tarkam Anukulam Apekshata. Until the appearance of Bhava Bhakti. So till the appearance of Bhava Bhakti, we have to use scriptural rules and logic. Bhava Avir Bhavane Avadi. Till then, there is use of logic. In performing sadhana bhakti, Vishwanath Chakravarti says, the Vaidhi bhakti practitioner will depend on scriptural injunctions and favorable use of logic until the appearance of rati. Rati means bhava. After the appearance of rati, he no longer depends on these things. However, as soon as greed manifests in him for attaining a bhava similar that of the Vrajvasis, this is Raganuga Bhakti now, he develops an inclination for Raga Bhakti. The practitioner of Raganuga Bhakti does not depend any longer on scriptural rules and logic. Thus, it is greatly superior. However, wherever that greed has appeared, it is understood that the person must have studied the scriptures in order to attain that greed. So greed has not suddenly overnight, sprung in his heart. Greed has appeared by studying the Shastras and applying logic, by studying Vaidhi Sadhana Bhakti. It is also necessary to study the scriptures in order to understand the proper sadhana for Raganuga Bhakti. So this so much Vishwanath Chakravarti spoke in the Ragavartma Chandrika, that we have to hear from Anuragi Bhaktas, we have to obtain knowledge. So the sadhana for Raganuga Bhakti also will come from the scriptures. So that is the point Vishwanath Chakravarti makes. So now we will, after discussing this qualification for practicing Vaidhi Sadhana, Raganuga Bhakti, now what are the actual practices of Raganuga Bhakti, which will be explained in 3 verses, which we will take up tomorrow. 3 verses are there, and each verse will take at least 1 class, because each verse is heavily loaded and we have to bit by bit discuss it. So any questions, any clarifications you have till now what we discussed? Any comments also if you have regarding, especially I was a little hesitant to explain Ragavartma Chandrika because I myself was not much acquainted with Sanskrit, but the English translations are very, very clear. But it was very important, I felt, at this point to discuss it, so I discussed it. So any questions or any clarifications you have till now what we discussed? Okay then, so we will stop here. It's almost 8:30. So tomorrow, Raganuga Bhakti, to practice, there are procedures given in the Shastra. So what kind of sadhana a Raganuga Bhakta who has developed his greed, what is his sadhana, what are his practices, Rupa Goswami is going to describe only in 3 verses. And these 3 verses are a subject matter of discussion, which we'll be having in the next few classes. So let's be geared up for understanding these practices. Thank you very much. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Srila Rupa Goswami Pad ki jai. Shri Bhakti Rasamrit Sindhu ki jai. Hare Krishna.